this general concept, which sounds blindingly obvious, but is incredibly rich, which is the outside world is more intelligent than you are. So use that as your first reference rather than the model you have of the world in your head.
Welcome to The Art of Quality, the podcast that explores the lived experience of guests who have a deep familiarity with quality in the domains of business, entrepreneurship, investing, and the arts. By sharing stories about how master practitioners experience their life's work, we hope to inspire others who are seeking to bring more quality into their lives. Our guest on this episode of The Art of Quality is Tom Morgan, who is undoubtedly one of the most curious people we have ever met. I was first put in touch with Tom by a mutual friend who'd suggested we get along as aficionados of the work of Ian McGilchrist, the clinical psychiatrist and neuroscientist now famous for his hemispheric theory of the brain. As consequential as these theories of the brain might be, our conversation with Tom reaches far beyond this fascinating topic in a free-flowing investigation of the relationship between curiosity, mythology, wisdom, intuition, and quality. Tom's obsessive interest in ideas that hold the potential for the greatest possible transformational impact in our lives is, in our sense, one of the main reasons for the rapidly growing popularity of his thinking in business and investing circles. What Tom is building at the leading edge is nothing short of astonishing, for the quality of the ideas he is drawing attention to, and for the speed at which he has gathered a community of world-class practitioners and wisdom seekers in pursuit of ever deeper self-knowledge. We hope you enjoy the conversation today. Tom Morgan, on behalf of the Quality Podcast, it is our great privilege and honor to welcome you today.
It is my delight to be here, gentlemen.
I want to open up with this experience I had yesterday on a leading edge call, where there were a few takeaways from that session. It felt incredibly rich, and I want to read those takeaways to all of us now. One, you only know something if you've tested it and it works. Two, stories are where the action is at. Biographies are where the action is at. Theory is not where the action is at. The action is in the tacit knowledge. Three, what really matters are the feedback loops to the field. And four, there is no expertise without practice. Don't trust anyone who has no practical experience. Now, we thought we were onto something with this quality project here, but I think you've stolen most, if not all, of any thunder we might ever have.
I'd like to say, for reference, almost all of those insights originated somewhere else, like all of my insights, and those were from Cedric Chin, whose genre is basically sound smart, does it work, which is the antidote to the listicle. I love him. I love him, and I love what he stands for, which is this general concept, which sounds blindingly obvious, but is incredibly rich, which is the outside world is more intelligent than you are. So use that as your first reference rather than the model you have of the world in your head. Sounds like everyone's like, duh. And I'm like, well, but do you live that way? And what are you doing to instantiate that in your life? And that's the cornerstone of his work. And I think it's almost a good jumping off point for where we are today.
It's a very powerful one. Now, this project that we're involved in, the Quality Podcast, is a wholehearted investigation of the many aspects and manifestations of this word quality. Tell us about how you relate to this notion when it comes to areas that have fascinated you in your life for the last few years.
I mean, like your guys is focused on business and investing, and whilst I'm extremely bad at both of those things, I think you almost immediately have to drop into the paradoxical and pretentious, which is to be like, quality by definition can't be defined. And that's fine, because you ask someone to define it, and you find out immediately something that feels good, something that pleases consumers, something that's made really well. All right, well, what does made really well mean? Like, I don't know, like it feels good, and you kind of go around in these circles. And so I've thought for a long time, you know, quality is the Tao. Quality is novelty. So quality is something that deliberately cannot be it cannot be named. It can only be pursued. And this may not be immediately intuitive, but the thing that kept coming out again and again and again for me about what quality was, or at least how you achieve quality, was space or slack. That effectively, to give like a mega simple example, that your customers will tell you whether your product is quality. But if there is not space in your process to receive really quick feedback from your customers, you'll not be able to produce quality. But there's also this idea of innovation, that if you're following one route, really, like, and particularly a route towards an abstract variable like users or profitability or engagement, if you're following that route to a metric that's ultimately dead, it precludes novelty. And if you don't have space within your operating system to pivot towards that interesting opportunity, or to run multiple experiments towards those opportunities, you can end up at like a local optima really, really fast, and then have no idea what you're doing because you've run out of road. And I get a bit miserable. I worked in the public markets for the best part of 20 years, and I get a bit miserable about it all. Me and my wife went on honeymoon to New Zealand. It's the best trip I've ever taken. It's the most beautiful place I've ever been. And one day we hiked 3 days from around Queenstown to Milford Sound. It's one of the most absurdly fake-looking, incredible places in the world. And in 3 days, we didn't hear a bird. And I asked our guide why we didn't hear a bird. And he basically said, because the Brits, always the Brits, introduced stoats. And the stoats could climb trees and pick off all the birds. Because there was no apex predators for the stoats. And so, in the modern capitalist sense, the stoats were great, right? Like they were fitter than anything else, and they've been introduced artificially into this environment and killed everything, because New Zealand is an incredibly, like unfit environment, I guess. But there was no diversity. And when I looked at what happened to the public markets over the last 20 years, these incredibly efficient companies have basically steamrolled everything else, and there's no diversity in the ecosystem at all. And anyone that studies anything to do with any of these, evolutionary theories knows that a non-diverse ecosystem is incredibly fragile. So I guess that's kind of a long-winded way of saying that, like, this kind of slack and space in a system ends up producing quality as a byproduct, both in business and in life.
Tell us more. Implicit in what you said, there's a cultural blind spot that we're talking about here.
Yep. We've talked about who's wise in the public eye. And it's such a blindingly difficult and frustrating conversation, because it's just like, try asking people who's wise. And you get kind of weird answers. Spiritual leaders, like, who's wise in business? People, some good examples like Rick Rubin or Brunello Cucinelli that seem to crop up more often than not. Peter Kaufman, who I know nothing about, but smart guys like you talk about a lot. My favorite is Rory Sutherland. And I don't know if you, how much you're familiar with his work, but like, he talks about this cultural sickness that is, the tyranny by spreadsheet, which is, if it can't be metricized, it doesn't have value. And I like him because he's a fool in the traditional sense that he uses humor to make incredibly profound points. And he's the opposite of almost all podcasters who are desperately trying to find stuff that sounds really smart, but it ultimately is kind of hollow. Whereas for Rory, everything sounds kind of lightweight and trivial. And then when you think about it for any time at all, you're like, oh, blimey, that's really, really smart. And he said something on the Rick Rubin podcast that was, anecdotes have value because they're interesting, and interesting is a signal. And that's like a cornerstone of my work. But basically, it's like business anecdotes that resonate. They resonate for a reason, and they should resonate for a reason. And what he talks about is this concept of space, where it's like, humans are irrational. And therefore, if you have the ability to experiment with things that seem irrational, it might produce like wild upside that cannot be metricized. He talks about, if your product is not selling, have you tried raising the price? Because, there was no expensive coffee or vacuum cleaner until Starbucks and Dyson existed. And it turned a grudge purchase of a vacuum cleaner into something that was a symbol of luxury. He also talks about how for Uber and the Tube, the greatest innovation they ever produced was telling you how long it was going to be before your train or your car arrived and showing you a little picture of your car. These things cannot be put in spreadsheets, but they're quality, right? It is something that you add psychologically to a business that improves the experience and cannot be quantified in any way. He makes this joke about how the British rail system, you could make it 20 minutes slower if you made the experience of being on the train nicer and more of it.
This is the one with supermodels. That's such a good story. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of depth there, but it also speaks to this, like, if you don't leave slack in the system for any of these counterintuitive or interesting experiments, you're kind of screwed.
Why can't we see this culturally? Why are we so blind to the need for slack?
I mean, I think a lot of it's psychological and neurological, and you can go as deep with this idea as you want. I think, like, something we talked about yesterday on this call is this guy, Dan Davies, who writes about the unaccountability machine. And it's almost a metaphor for the way that our neurology acts, that basically businesses are now layered with so many different managerial like abstractions that no one's actually responsible for hard decisions, but also no one really takes the upside from good decisions. So like the management team is so abstracted from the real world and those feedback loops that they get stuck in the local optima really fast. But also like the person that proposes the crazy strategy gets fired really fast. And I think within business that's a major factor. But also like we don't place any value on heuristics as a whole. Like that's why the whole Kahneman genre like just grates with me so much, because it's like we must remove all of these evolutionary heuristics that have allowed us to be adapted to our environment for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, because we need to be perfectly rational man. Like system one, intuition, is useless. System two, deep thinking, is the only thing of value. And you read McGilchrist, and McGilchrist is like, no, expert intuition is probably more useful than dumb rationality. We have it all backwards. And so I think it's a cultural sickness right now.
Do you think my mind immediately goes to sort of the zeitgeist of the last few decades, if not longer, has been, or probably really since the Enlightenment, has been we have it within our reach to fully understand everything. And so we sort of build these models of how we think the world works and then kind of try to cram the world into them instead of realizing how little we know, and therefore we have to go back to your kind of sound smart, does it work idea from Cedric. So how do you say a little more on how you think we got here? And then obviously, that leads to, are there ways out?
I think the answer is in the question, in a way that one of the first pieces I wrote for The Leading Edge was about embodied intuition. And my expert in a couple of weeks is this guy, Rivakanna, who talks a lot about somatic sensing. And if you read at any depth about really good operators and investors, it does not take very long before you realize that they have embodied intuition, right? There's a few people who are just like better calculators than anyone else. But like one of my friends works for the biggest quant hedge fund in the world, and he has a team of 1,000, math Olympians running 1,000 strategies an hour. So I'm like, cool, if you're a good calculator, good luck, man. Good luck. Like you might be able to see stuff others can't, but not for how long. So it's like this concept of embodied intuition that sounds mysterious, but totally isn't, that also gets utterly denigrated by our left hemispheric world. I think that's the problem and the solution. That basically, like, I've spoken to investors with 30 years in the, I had a really funny thing happen where basically, like, I wrote a piece a while ago about how really good investors often couldn't explain their investment decisions because they were so intuitive, and they had all these demands from consultants to have a process that people could fit into a box, right? Which is fair enough in terms of the agency frictions on both sides. And that piece ended up going to like the front page of Hacker News. And the great thing about going to the front page of Hacker News is you get loads of engagement. And the worst thing about the front page of Hacker News is all of the comments. And basically, like, all of the comments were like, this guy's a moron. This is not how investing works. No one does this job intuitively. And like simultaneously, I got a guy who'd been a PM for 30 years at a major institution being like, oh, thank God someone's writing about this. where he was like, oh, thank God someone can admit that like so much of this is intuitive. And the moment, and like one of the things McGilchrist argues is that the moment you try and codify an intuitive process, you can destroy it.
So much good stuff there. A piece of me wonders how is our bucket for things I don't know big enough, and was it ever bigger and we just shrunk it, or what? Since you mentioned investors, I mean, some of the most interesting ones in my view are ones where if you speak with them enough, you realize they had an idea, often a reasonably articulate idea of where an investment could go. If it goes phenomenally well, they won't necessarily say when they're honest, I knew it would go that way. It's more that I knew it maybe could go that way. And occasionally when something blows up on you, you say, well, I think I made I made a good decision for the right reasons, and I couldn't see how this would go badly, but it did. And so my point is sort of, it seems to me like we're sort of, the zeitgeist of our world has been one of, let's try anything that looks like uncertainty. Let's try to kill it and kill it and kill it and narrow it down. And that leads itself very well to a world of consultants that are trying to codify everything and say we need to follow the process and so on. And I just don't think that's how things work, honestly. But you've gone much deeper on this than I have. So say more on that. Or do we just need to get a little more humble and allow for a little more uncertainty, or kind of help us find the way out of this?
I think it's, again, you have to go back to databases. So I had a conversation with a guy that's been doing this for 40 years, maybe 50, and he crushed 2008 because he didn't own energy and financials. And then he had like some 24-year-old consultant come in to look at their fund, and he basically asked why they crushed 2008, and the guy was like, "Well, I just think we really got lucky ultimately." And the consultant walks out and downgrades their fund, right? This guy doesn't have a repeatable process. I'm not interested. Now, I don't know the reason why they did or didn't like have that, but I'm guessing it was because this guy had 4 years of experience, or maybe he did get lucky. But there's a nuance to this that isn't obvious, that like the humility, your humility should be in relation to your experience, but also you need to know a lot of things. Like the way I look at it is just simply in terms of a reservoir. That it's why Cedric Chin's work on case studies is so important, that you're reading case studies to fill a reservoir, and you're just doing it constantly, which is why in investing, or really anything you do with your life, you have to be so passionate about it, because what matters is the depth of your reservoir. And then when you encounter something, so like, this is his whole point about Charlie Munger reasoning from analogy, and why I find it so profound. That basically, like, Charlie Munger sees something today. It's like, oh, so NVIDIA's doing this. And he goes, oh, this reminds me of like Coke in 1952. And what you're actually hearing there is Charlie's pattern recognition, like when Charlie was alive. We're basically saying there may be 1,000 different facets of these two things that I'm unconsciously putting together, and then I'm getting pattern recognition on the basis of that extraordinary reservoir that often shows up somatically. So it's like, did I know something or did I not know something? That for me is not necessarily the question. It's how deep was my reservoir of relevant cases, such that when something new shows up, something goes boop in the unconscious, triggers it, and I'm like, oh, that's the same as, well, that's close. It's never the same, right? That's close enough to that allows me to make a decision related to something else. And this goes into something that my friend, Frederick Giesken wrote about walking with a woman that's a bird expert through a nature reserve. And it's the idea that when she walks through the nature reserve, she inhabits a completely different world to you and I because of the things that she hears. She's like, oh, that bird's talking to that bird needs this, that bird needs that. Those things are still happening. They're just not being served to our awareness because we don't have any experience with them. And I'm like an extremely mediocre jiu-jitsu guy. The black belt in my gym inhabits a completely different world from me in the same dojo, because when he feels an incredibly subtle muscle move on me, he knows exactly how to counter it. So it's about this idea of like, it's sort of related to how much you know and how much humility you have, but for me, it's database depth that's the really important framework.
Well, I'd love for you to bring in the dimension of curiosity here. We've talked about the role of intuition. We've talked about how we have a cultural blind spot around intuition. We have this paradox that the more we cultivate our rational faculties, the more society seems to descend into chaos. And you've laid out, I guess through your own lived experience, how you might reclaim some relationship with intuition. And actually, could you tell us about how you define intuition and as a way of knowing, and how it fits into to a context of ways of knowing?
Yeah. I like the description of a subtle spiritual insight. To go into the woo immediately, I was reading a really interesting paper about the evidence for precognition, where people would be shown a colored photo and they would gain the ability for a certain number of reps to be precognitive about what colored photo was going to be shown next. And the participants described when they were about to get a right answer as like the feeling of butterflies in their chest. And I often think about that as the context for intuition, where it's this sudden ping. For me, my intuition manifests most strongly when I get a recommendation for someone to meet, but mostly something to read. Someone will say, have you tried reading this? This for me happens 20 times a week because of my job. And there'll be this combination of, yes, this is all the topics that I'm reading about right now. So this kind of left hemisphere, like, yeah, this fits with my general genre of interest, but there's something very different in there that is like an energetic little buzz. And often I'll tear through a book that isn't interesting. And I don't know why until so Waldrop's Complexity, right? The description of the founding of the Santa Fe Institute, in my opinion, is not an interesting book. But in the final chapter, there's sort of this incredibly subtle description of what the meaning of life is in terms of this division between order and chaos. Now, I tore through that book like my life depended on it, despite the fact that it was boring. But at the end of the book, there was an idea in there that was formative to all of my theories. And that for me was like crazy interesting. Like even in retrospect, I was like, how did I know? Like I read that book in a very qualitatively different way to the way I would read other books. And yet it was not immediately interesting to me. And that dynamic is something I've noticed. So that is how intuition shows up for me in my life.
How would you describe the relationship between intuition and curiosity in your life?
I think they're super close to the extent that I, for what I do, my domain is so broad. I mean, curiosity is really interesting. Like I did a speech for the Sohn conference earlier this year and got 500,000 views because the idea of curiosity is so incredibly deep that no one actually knows what curiosity is. Like no one knows what it is. I always said like the dictionary definition is a strong desire to know or learn something, which smuggles in like at least two premises: that you know where that desire comes from and you know what the something is. And if anyone's listening to this that doesn't know anything about my genre, I would say I wrote a piece about attractors this weekend, but like read about attractors. Attractors are this concept that violates everything post-enlightenment. and yet is also practical and interesting, which is the idea that our environment somehow signals to us what to pay attention to, that our environment is combinatorially explosive. There are too many options and too little time. And there is some sort of reciprocal relationship you can have with your environment, including the information that you consume, that helps direct your evolution. In a world where we think we live in a dead box of atoms that's indifferent to us, that just doesn't fit our paradigm. But for me, if you start to navigate towards your curiosity, that's an indication of where you should be pointed for your evolution. But it's uncertain, it's capricious, it's subtle. The neurological framing I have for it is that your exploratory attention is driven by your right hemisphere, and your right hemisphere is embodied, somatic, emotional, non-verbal, non-logical. So when you get these subtle pulls, they're going to be things that your left hemisphere is not going to trust. But also your left hemisphere is operating in the presence of more information, much, much, much more information than your left hemisphere. So I'm kind of like, guys, you don't burn your life down because you've had a sudden urge to be a break dancer, but like give that pull more weight in your decision making process. Is like, if that could be my sole contribution to the world, then I would be very happy with it.
What have you learned over the years as you've been pulling on these threads about our capacity to experience these subtle pulls? I think we all, and I'll just speak for myself, I've spent much of my life alienated from my body, living in my head, as many of us do. What has worked for you over the years in coming into relationship with your body as a receptor for this subtle pull?
I think I'm still very early in this. Yeah, if you've listened to 30 seconds of me speak or read one paragraph of my writing, you can tell that I'm heavily intellectualized to a degree that can be very dangerous and unpleasant. And I have a tendency to dissociate with my family, with my friends. Like, I love thinking about these kinds of ideas, and it takes me away from the world. So I shouldn't be held up as a model of anything. But I have found John Vervaeke, who for me is one of those guys in that category of like, who's a wise dude. I found him very inspirational, and he talks about an ecology of practice, where it's like you have to have a series of interweaved and mutually balancing pursuits and practices. So for me, I write about things I find meaningful to banging melodic dance music. And that puts me in flow for 4 hours a day, easy. Then I go and do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is, I believe that for certain people, you need a really powerful countervailing force against both the weapons of mass distraction, but also your own psyche. And there's nothing like a 250-pound man trying to choke you unconscious to focus the mind. And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is the single most beneficial, like, normie pursuit that I've ever encountered. All of the cliches from the Rogans of this world are completely true. And then I get a massage once a week, which isn't a pursuit, but I joke to my wife it should be a business expense, because all my best thinking happens on that massage table. All of the resolution of all the threads happens there. And then I've started DJing, and I really enjoy DJing. It puts me in flow. I enjoy playing music for other people. So there's this kind of relational aspect, although I will not allow them to request songs, so there's not much feedback. But basically, like, I found a bunch of stuff that I would do anyway, and it's all dynamic. So that helps kind of like get me out of my head. But I think there's something else, and Will, you and I have talked about this recently, but I just finished kind of writing and putting together most of this series. And when I finished it, something dropped out the bottom that really, really surprised me. And it was this word that we've already used a couple of times. And this word was subtle. That basically, like, the expert can see something that's so subtle, often he can't explain why he can see it. But Gilchrist tells this story about this horse trainer, Frank Murrier, who became basically a betting conduit, that he would see a horse warm up for a couple of minutes and then be able to produce better odds than the bookmakers. We was asked how he did it. He said no. He said he didn't know. And then again, when he tried to codify the process, it impaired it. So like he didn't know how he was doing it because it was so subtle. And then I had a penny drop for me, which and probably is like embarrassingly obvious for everyone else. But I was like, oh, the reason why you clean up your diet, the reason why you meditate, the reason why you do breath work, a lot of guys in our community are like, it's going to take you into some crazy altered state that's going to help you break frame. I'm like, yeah, that we tend to take this kind of a hacky extreme. I'm like, actually, the point of these things is to increase our subtle sensitivity because the attractors are subtle. So your life is constantly being guided by attractors that might be benign and might be more intelligent than you. But if the volume's too loud, you're not going to hear them. And I was like, oh, that's the point. And it's the same as what we're talking about as quality, which is something that just came to me, right? Like if you don't have the space in your business for the subtleness of the attractors, for the subtleness of quality, for the subtleness of the feedback, you're going to miss it.
There's a part of this conversation that feels like it would be enriched by bringing in a dimension around storytelling, which has been pretty consistent in your work over the years. Good stories, bad stories, the ways in which the stories we tell ourselves allow or prevent us from seeing things. What's the new story then? I think we've looked at the ways in which the old story is quite sorely lacking around ways of knowing, around the role of intuition, the imbalance of the hemispheres. What is a new story feel like for you?
New story is the old story. I think first, the whole story genre of like people talking about story, I kind of hate it. And one of the reasons why I hate it most is because one of the biggest points that people miss. So everyone sent me this study a few weeks ago, which is like, if you frame your life as a hero's journey, it improves your sense of meaning. And I'm like, no, you don't get to decide where on the hero's journey you are. Like if you're in your parents' basement, you can't frame yourself as the guy who's crossing the threshold because you're in your parents' basement. The point of all of these stories is that they reflect hidden forces that are extremely real, that are neglected by our society, and they show you their maps, and they show you where on the map you are. And then you do not get to decide where on the map you are. And I think, where are we now? Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul follow a trope that is basically, you have a gift, Walter White's a chemistry teacher, or, Saul Goodman, Jimmy McGill, as he starts off, is a really, really articulate dude. And they sequentially misuse their left hemispheric gifts and they become different people. Walter White becomes Heisenberg and Jimmy McGill becomes Saul Goodman. They both become disconnected, sinister, evil versions of themselves. And this is reflected currently in the mad scientist trope that that trope has existed for like 100 years. And it exists because we know somehow deep down the guy that's manipulating the forces of nature for more power is insane. So what does this have to do with business? It's basically the people that are using willpower and brute force and the straight stoat-like influence to try and get what they want. That runs out of road eventually. What is the story coming? It's the hero's journey, and the hero's journey is the process through which we learn to harmonize with attractors. It's about the surrender of the ego towards a force greater than ourselves that can guide our collective evolution. The way I think about it within a capitalist context is that capitalism is the best system that we have, but capitalism includes shadow. So everything that's wrong with humans gets incorporated into the capitalist system. So great, what's next? It's a system driven by attractors. It's a system driven by an external intelligence and the acknowledgement of an external intelligence that's good. That, I think, is the story. And to get even more woo, if you want to know what the story is, look what stories are winning, right? You know what story is winning right now? Dune is winning. Dune 2 is winning. And what is that about? Dune is about Paul Atreides becoming more and more aligned with some sort of spiritual aligning force and then gaining subtle abilities. He gains psychic powers as a result of his alignment with those abilities. And whether or not you think psychic powers are literally true or not, and my jury is currently out on that, it's this concept of like power is actually defined by your ability to notice and influence the subtle. And yeah, Paul Atreides goes off the rails at the end and alienates his misses and all that sort of stuff. But like that genre of the next stage of human evolution being the responsible manipulation of subtle power, I think is one of the stories that you're seeing emerge right now and you're going to continue seeing emerge.
Tom, coming back to this idea of the space that you need for the subtleness to appear, what what does that space look like? You mentioned in a business context that that space typically is lacking, and then the intuition is lacking as well. What does that space look like? Who have you seen who've kind of gotten their head around that, and what do they do differently to kind of everyone else as they're going through life?
Yeah, I'd recommend there's a great podcast with Russ Roberts and Margaret Heffernan, who wrote a book called Uncharted about business experiments. And I won't get the details right, but she talks about how I think in Holland, nurses were allocated for rehab to homes for people coming out of operating procedures, and it was terrible. It was a terrible system because it was all done in an automated way. And then what they did is they basically said, "You're a nurse with experience. You determine how long you need to spend with this person." And this sounds obvious, but like the gains were stratospheric and immediate. That basically the nurse was like, "I've got lots of experience. This person needs 30 days. This person needs 5 minutes." And you suddenly injected space into that system. What was the space you injected? Expert intuition. What was the result? Efficiency. What was it working against? A predefined time period. Who set the predefined time period? Someone that didn't have enough information, because they didn't have any information about the person that they were facing. And every person was different. And I was just like, that's kind of pretty elegant.
It's so interesting how that seems to be a common frame of a lot of multidisciplinary problems that exist across different businesses generally. And they all seem to be trying to come back to this multidisciplinary model, and it's client centric or customer centric or patient centric in a hospital setting. And they all seem to be trying to undo what was done with that framing and with that mindset that you've just described, and really struggling, frankly. I think a lot of them have this amazing activation energy, but they can't bring it back to the whole again, if that makes sense. They can't reintegrate that space that you're talking to. So it's it's a really interesting way of building that I think a lot of businesses I see would really benefit from it takes a lot of, I think there's an element of bravery, right? Because space requires courage for the person to actually give space and slack for there to be a longer term feedback loop for it to feed back into them looking great. And so there's a nuance there that probably a lot of systems don't allow for. But it's really interesting.
It also requires the vulnerability of connection and the risk that you get hurt. So McGilchrist talks about how the best suicide prevention indicator he encountered was a nurse with 30 years of experience. And she'd just be like, that person doesn't look good. And she wouldn't be able to articulate why. Same principle again. But if you're on the front lines of medicine, I don't know how many people you need to see a day, but it's something that's wildly at odds with anything in our evolutionary past, where you're being called to connect to 100 people having the worst days of their lives, right? If you actually did that, you'd go insane. You'd go insane in a week. You'd burn out in a week. So you cannot afford to have a relationship with anyone in your emergency room, which makes you semi-psychopathic quite quickly, because you have to regard people as sacks of meat. Otherwise, you will go mad. And I think that ethos of of like mechanizing caring professions. There's no way around it. But I remember like my experiences with American psychiatry were horrific, like actually filled with horror, because you had this moment several times when you realized the other person was not listening to you at all. They were trying to diagnose you. They were trying to titrate the amount of medication that you needed based on a level of experience they had. And they didn't actually really engage with the substance of what you were saying at all, because it was taken as a symptom of insanity. And that actively made me worse. Right, like it meant that I was in a quote unquote caring profession. I would walk into a psychiatrist's office every day expecting some kind of connection and to meet some kind of savior, and instead I just met a scalpel.
So let me try to connect this back to, you said something of from McGilchrist earlier that it was something like, as soon as you try to codify something, you kill the magic. I'm sure I butchered that, but that was the sentiment, and it made me think. I mean, a lot of connections are coming together in my head here. So I was just reading a company report earlier today, and they were going on and on about the benefits of radically decentralizing the organization and pushing the decisions as close to the client as possible. And then yesterday I read a trained neurosurgeon who effectively completely quit because of what you just said. He was sort of, by the time he got to the patient, he was running a playbook someone else gave him. He had no agency in it, and there was nothing about, is this even the right thing to do with the patients? Just go get your scalpel and do your thing. And so it seems very human to want to see patterns in things, so to speak. And it seems very reasonable to kind of try to say, okay, I observe this here, here, and here. Yeah, I mean, even take decentralization. Like, in some ways, we're saying, okay, we got to push decisions close to the customer. That's a pattern that we see some good in. We can try to repeat that other places. And yet, sort of by trying to find the pattern, we start to kill the magic in a way. So how would we think through that?
I think it's yes and all the way down. Like, people who read McGilchrist naively, without sounding too condescending, they're like, right hemisphere good, left hemisphere bad. And that kind of is the bias of his work, but it's actually that, like, the left hemisphere is competitive and confabulates and dismisses the right. The right's like, oh, I can't wait to work with you, left hemisphere, because you give me all this discernment and analysis that is not core to the way that I regard the world. And I think about people that are psychotic who I've met, who basically see pattern everywhere. They see dots everywhere, even where the pattern doesn't exist. And then there's the guys who are like mega autistic that see no pattern anywhere. And so it's all balance all the way down, which is like, I've just seen a bunch of dots. Do I feel the dots in my body? Do I have that ping moment that's based on the quality of my database that determines whether there's a pattern there? The point is absolutely not that pattern recognition is bad. The point is that am I picking up on something that's actually real? And I just think that people don't understand that that's often an embodied sense. It seems like it's coming from your head, but then, like, how can it be coming from your head? Because your head would have to be immediately running every experience you've ever had. The example I give investors is the idea of interacting with people, that when there's something off about the way that someone's acting in like a management meeting, like, you can tell, but you don't know how you can tell, but you can tell because you've had like a million face-to-face interactions with people. So the depth of your database as to when someone's just off is ridiculous. And it's why autistic people don't make eye contact, because the human face is throwing off so much data at any one time. They can't work out what to pay attention to at all, and it's just totally overwhelming. And I think that's a huge part of it, that it's not good or bad. It's just, where's the balance? And I think the balance does have to be towards the right hemisphere, because, to go back to what we were saying up top, to assume the outside world has more intelligence than you is the hallmark of greatness in both business, investing, and life.
Yeah, it's making me think of we spent some time with Alice in Paradise on the spot a few weeks ago, and I know you're talking to her in your upcoming series. And one of the things that I've thought the most about that she said was 4 to 7 year olds can be phenomenal judges of character. And then we sort of train children out of the intuition of, this person means ill towards me or this person means well toward me, and kind of try to give them this whole sort of overly rationalistic thing. And yeah, I've thought a lot about like what do we need to what's the undoing that we need to accept where, maybe the intuition actually is pretty well tuned and we've just overrun it with left hemisphere stuff. Um, Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, hard to know where the balance is, but I think it's a very fair and well taken point that it's if you kind of find yourself on either side to the extreme, you probably need to back off a bit.
My answer is very straightforward, which is synchronicity, which is basically like one that violates most people's models of the world. Like I think it's called pseudoscience on its Wikipedia page, which is now the ultimate Streisand effect for me to want to read about something is calling it pseudoscience. Um, but it's like synchronicity. Like Will knows more than anyone else. I've gone down a lot of woo rabbit holes over the last 12 months, and synchronicity is the one where I come back to. I'm like, oh yeah, that's a thing. Like when I feel a cluster of meaningful coincidences, and the key is feel. I know that's a thing, and it's a way that I live my life, and it's a huge guidepost for me right now. It's embodied, it's pattern recognition, and it's guidance based on the entirety of your environment. You get it wrong, right? Like, and there's all sorts of things I don't understand, like negative synchronicity and what that means, but it's a thing, and your life changes the moment you accept the existence of synchronicity, or even the possibility of the existence of synchronicity. Like that's what needs to be unlearned, which is that there's no such thing as there's no such thing as a meaningful coincidence, right? Like it's all just noise. Like the most common response is that like if I tell you to pay attention to green, you'll notice more green things. Those green things existed. And I'm like, that's just not how synchronicity works. The new things come into the world as a result of that.
Tom, what tools? Because so the language and tools of synchronicity is something that I just find fascinating generally. What tools have you found helpful for you to learn the language for that feedback loop around synchronicity and attractors, and like what does that actually look like day to day? I know we talked to meditation, and but do you journal around it? Are there other ways that you've learned to do this? Because I feel like it's a very counterintuitive thing for people. I don't think there's many places where we teach that.
Yeah, subtle pulls again, which I'm not good at. I'm a bad example of a person that does that. I think energetic pulls, where I was talking about earlier, like, oh, you should really meet Paul, and they'll be like, ping, and I'll be like, all right, I really should meet Paul. And then when I meet Paul, I come out with more energy than I went in. And there was a couple of synchronicities in there, like, oh, I didn't realize you knew Anna. Oh my God, we're super great friends. Or like, I can't believe you're working on this right now. I'm working on the exact same thing. That that's like a mini synchronicity, but it's a sign that that's someone I want to get to know and keep knowing, right? And I want to walk down the path with that person. Same with book recommendations. And then I write a lot, and then I understand things through writing. And then, without sounding too weird, I get downloads increasingly of what I'm going to write about. I have no idea where they come from, but the act of synthesizing a lot of ideas helps me manage synchronicity. As I've been doing this series, the thing that has surprised me the most, and I think I'm very, very early in this journey, is dreams. That Jung and Campbell, and really anyone that you need to take seriously, particularly Swedenborg, who's been this guy that's come into my orbit really recently, they're all like mega crazy into dreams. And it hasn't been recorded yet, so I hope I'm not trailing something that then doesn't exist. But there's a guy, Dan Lawrence, who is an ex-trader and the most qualified mental health professional I've ever met, is a Jungian and dream expert. And he basically applies his pattern recognition skills from trading to the analysis of people's dreams to find the correspondences and synchronicities. And from what I understand is the better a relationship you get with your dreams, the more synchronicity comes into your life. I've seen it a little bit, but I think that's going to be an area for me that's very fruitful over time. And obviously sounds completely batshit insane to anyone else.
It's fascinating. The what I might add to that is I sort of, not that long ago, had a life where the calendar, was literally full. And then I chose to kind of take a hard left or right turn towards a life where the calendar's generally pretty empty. And I've noticed all sorts of just really, really, really simple things, like I have time to think about something interesting that you said earlier in this conversation later today when I walk home for 20 minutes or whatever, things where it just, I mean, none of this for me has been profound. It's sort of been more pedestrian of like, I'm not always on the phone. And then interesting thoughts seem to happen more frequently, you know, and I don't know that we could explain all of what's going on in the brain other than I think it's, if you invert that problem in a way, I think it's sort of true that if you always keep stuff in front of you, there's no opportunity for anything else to happen.
Mm-hmm. And we don't know where ideas come from, right? And I think there's, for me, as I'm guessing most formerly type A people or currently type A people, there's a huge amount of guilt tied to that. That like I've now, after 43 years, managed to get to a point where I'm in control of my calendar, in full control. But if there was nothing on my calendar today, I'd feel shitty about that. I'd feel deficient. I'd feel like I'm screwing up somehow, like I'm not being fair to my family by not doing anything today. I'm being lazy. And yet I found that contemplative time has alpha quite unlike the rest of it, right? And so I'm still managing that dissonance well, that like my calendar has been rammed since I started this business because I'm interviewing everyone face to face. But also I think it's been a reaction to the fact that like if I started my own business and then had like a week of dead calendar, one, I'd go insane, but two, I'd feel very guilty about that. You know what, I finally saw the correct quote the other day because I've been mangling it. But the way I think about my intellect is the expression is if you don't give a husky an interesting problem, it becomes an interesting problem. And I love that expression because that's basically how my brain is. That like if I don't give the thinky part of my brain, the left hemisphere that thinks it's in charge, if I don't give it something fun to think about, it's going to tear my life apart. And so like you have to keep this balance, to your point, of like this contemplative time. But if you don't balance it, for me, like with something for the husky to chew on, like you're going to get in trouble quite quickly. And I haven't got that balance right, and I'm not sure I ever will.
Well, even just considering it, so I think one of Paul Graham's recent essays, he spends quite a bit of time making the point that there's a type of thinking that can only be done in writing, and it's not accessible if you literally aren't writing. And then he kind of flips it around and says, so there's actually a whole world that's, if that's true, and I think he argues well, then there's sort of a whole world of just logic and intuition that is inaccessible if you don't write.
Yeah.
So really interesting, and I think that's probably true beyond just writing, but it's really interesting that you sort of wall yourself off from an enormous amount of possibility by just not making space for the things that can't be planned. We don't know where ideas come from, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm going to be really weird about it, I find that things I write about get reflected and are reflected in my lived experience. So the day I finally chose to quit my last job at Sapient, I woke up the next morning with an article fully formed in my head. And the article was about the single biggest idea that I've ever contemplated. And I think the idea with the greatest economic impact of anything I've ever contemplated, which is, I talked about this kind of this holonic evolution of capitalism from being guided by collective human intelligence to being guided by something else, right? Like this collective transcendent intelligence, which most people don't think exists, right? If you find the magical niche where what only you can do meets what that system needs, right? A fully integrated use of your life, the system will respond with abundance. And most people look at this from very justifiably a perspective of privilege, right? Which is like, most people cannot even begin to have that conversation because they're at a subsistence level. To which I say, arguably the most heretical and offensive thing ever, which is, are you sure? Right? I don't know. My guess is that this isn't true. But imagine if everyone was suddenly aware of what their path was and had a means of following it. Is the guiding intelligence of this system that we inhabit smart enough to reconfigure the global economy in a short enough amount of time that we don't end up back in the Stone Age? Could it do it overnight? Presumably it can do anything. And then the only thing that would be lacking then would be the faith by the individual that this would work. And so that's literally why I just quit my job. Because I was like, I'm in an extraordinarily comfortable firm filled with great people where I'm very, very happy, but it's getting sequentially less and less interesting to me. And as Will testify, for the last year, I've been talking about doing something and not done anything about it because, one, it wasn't fully formed, but two, I was just being a bit of a coward about it. And I've done it. So far, so good. It's worked. But it's sort of this idea of like, you've got to test this stuff against reality, to Will's point up front. But it's also like, I've talked to a lot of people in transition. And when I've said, does the universe love you? A lot of them have burst into tears because we have this idea that if you leapt into something that you were sure was the right thing, you wouldn't be held. So people don't leap, but they don't do that in an economic perspective. They also don't do it in a corporate perspective. You know, like what everything that we've been talking about, which is that like, I have a really strong intuition that this is going to work, but I don't believe I'll be held either by my colleagues or by the market or anything if I do this. And fair enough, getting those intuitions right on both sides is really, really hard. And you can blow up, as I have a number of times, getting there. But it's that process and the belief that there's some base reality that is loving that I think is a transformational idea that actually has like wild economic impact because there'd be no one working as accountants like tomorrow.
What have your greatest influences been on this, I guess, this shift in your perspective? Or has it been a shift? Have you always believed that the world is a loving place?
No, never. No, absolutely not. I had a direct experience, which we can talk about in a bit, but the influences have been the people that talk about hidden forces and have experienced them. Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, I'm guessing Ian McGilchrist, given that his whole model points towards the existence of hidden forces. Those are probably the top three. And I think there's a lot of alpha in studying them.
Well, the word hidden is interesting.
What does hidden force mean? I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Will. Interested to unpack that.
I love it,
first
Paul.
time I've ever come across it.
Yeah, we're struck by maybe the same kind of notion of what do we mean by hidden and hidden to who? Because I think from a certain perspective, an embodied perspective, a perspective that is rooted in ways of knowing beyond just the rational intellect, that these forces are not so hidden. They're actually quite reliable in some ways.
Then they're not hidden to you, right? That's my point, is that they were only hidden. They're only like post-enlightenment hidden. Try having this conversation with people. That's why I titled my presentation "The Most Heretical Idea in Western Civilization." This, you know, the idea of relation. It's a wonderful podcast by Josh Schreier, The Emerald, where he's basically like, when we encountered other societies that believed the world was animist, we just assumed that they were all magical thinking, irrespective of the fact that 99% of human history has regarded the world as relational, and that maybe we're the baddies, right? Like maybe we're the bad guys. And so I'm like, these things like legit exist. You know, Will, you recommended a book to me last week that was absolutely superb. And the argument is mega simple, which is that there's entropy, which is obvious. Things fall apart. You're going to die, right? Like, it's what freaks out everyone in Silicon Valley. Like, things fall apart. Obvious. Heat death of the universe, yada, yada. And then there's this symmetrical force called syntropy, which works from the future, which scrambles my brain, so I'm not going to bother with that. But, like, it's an attractor experienced in the solar plexus that guides us towards greater complexity and integration and wholeness and consciousness. And like, I think that's an intuitively obvious point, that yes, you're going to die and things are going to die, but the general trend looking outside the window is towards greater complexity. So both of these things operate at the same time. And indeed, like, they're operating in a moment to moment basis, that your model of the world is constantly getting updated. You're dying right now. And one of the core things that comes out of this wisdom series is the need for your model of the world to die. That, like, it gets stale, it gets out of date, you encounter an anomaly that needs to break it, you break it, it dies, and then it's reborn in a better shape, right? So, like, that's entropy and syntropy working harmoniously at the same time. That this part of you needed to die, and it can be bloody awful, but it's dead now. And that syntropy, because it feels like love, which a lot of us are blocked to because of our own little traumatic and psychological reasons, because it feels like love, people ignore it. And because the number of different things that violate the Newtonian and Darwinistic worldview that you have to smuggle in as a result of syntropy break people's brains. But the biggest one, I think, is that the left hemisphere assumes it's the smartest guy in the room when it isn't. And to give people a little bit more grace, Will and I talk a lot about, ontological shock, that learning that you have to surrender your willpower to a force that's more intelligent can break your entire life. Not least because you've made the wrong decisions, but also because you need to reconfigure your life towards that. But also because all the premises that you've based everything that you've learned on in your entire life on. And I say Newtonian and Darwinistic, even though Newton wasn't Newtonian and Darwin wasn't Darwinistic in any of the traditional understandings of the word. But you just have to reconfigure everything. And that breakdown of your system is like, can be really incredibly psychologically dangerous, because I experienced it.
Wouldn't it be great if there were communities where we could get together and figure this stuff out?
Someone should start one.
I'm waiting.
We're all waiting.
Let's go ahead, Paul, and then I want to jump back on the community point.
Yeah. No, it's a really quick one. Like, Tom, if we sit down with somebody who has this subtle awareness that we're speaking to, and they have this embodied knowledge, and you also mentioned earlier on that it's very difficult for them to actually communicate their idea of. It's actually a subtlety that's an intuition, and when you try to get them to put into that tactical playbook, it falls apart. From your experience, do you see the same person who writes the playbook that actually has signal rather than just noise? It has to almost be a separate person to the person with the intuition. Or do you think that there are some who can also experience and communicate? Because certainly at a sport level, I know Tiger Woods, a lot of the most famous guys are awful at actually prescribing the path when they look retrospectively, because effectively it becomes this overly complex thing that they have a different awareness, and they're trying to then project that back onto someone who's at a very different point. Do you have a similar experience when it comes to some of these ideas and actually trying to distinguish between those two players with ideas and who has the intuition, the actual embodied intuition?
I think it's a super great question. I'll relate it to the community that I formed, right? Which I basically like road tested a bunch of communities over the last couple of years. And you have the right hemispheric communities, which, to be unkind, tend to be people that have never built any executive function, don't have any skills, don't have any wealth, don't have any influence, but they're quite, awake. And what they tend to do is talk about systemic issues. Like, wouldn't it be great if we can fix capitalism or AI safety? And I'm always like, do you know any of the 20 people in Silicon Valley that are involved in AI safety that can make a difference? And they're like, no. Then I'm like, then what are you doing? And for me, the focus of Leading Edge has basically, like, based on who has already joined it, it's people who I would describe as left hemispheric, but curious about the right hemisphere at some stage of that journey. I will take a left hemispheric person trying to work on themselves over a right hemispheric person trying to change the world every day and Sunday, because the leverage of a high agency person shifting their own mentality and working out where to act in the world is immensely higher than someone who has no executive function looking at systemic problems from a position that they can't influence. And I think that inversion is something that's really important. And I think to address the second part of your statement, what I am trying to do right now is also what Jung was trying to do, except obviously Jung is a giant and I'm in my bedroom, where Jung was like, Jung went and he saw some stuff, man. He saw some stuff, right? And then he came back and he was like, if I tell anyone about this, they're not going to listen because it's too goddamn weird. So I'm going to write a psychological theory that corresponds to this metaphorically. And I believe that there's a sweet spot that I certainly haven't found where basically people can communicate the woo with enough discernment and scientific grounding to work as a Trojan horse to get people into these ideas without tripping the new age triggers.
Say it occurs to me you've used the woo frequently. I don't know that we've defined it yet. Can you just maybe for those that don't use woo regularly help us understand what it is?
I don't have a good definition of the word. I think it's like there's some stuff that I think is just like obviously wrong, but I don't know what that is anymore. That like I'd say manifestation, right? That like if I just want to make myself like crazy successful and wealthy, I just have to think about it. And there's some truth in that statement, but like it's taken to kind of a ludicrous extreme. Or like if you buy this crystal, it's going to do X, Y, and Z for you. And a lot of this is like bad science propagated by people that don't understand how things work and taken to a very extreme right hemispheric perspective. I'm actually getting increasingly more and more sympathetic to a lot of these theories because I see the seed of something much more profound in them. So it's as I'm speaking, it's actually really difficult for me to think about something that's actually whole scale woo. I can think about things that probably aren't true, but even me dismissing those is quite high. I think woo is like porn. It's in the eye of the beholder. You know it when you see it, where it's like, this thing has just tripped my skepticism. And as a result, I'm now out. So every article in my series is going to have a woo rating as sort of a disabling mechanism. Whereas like my friend Mona spent the whole pandemic going through all of the published research on psychic phenomena, precognition, remote viewing, telepathy. And she found that from a historical perspective and from a research perspective, it's as robust pretty much as you can expect, even as a quote unquote subtle force. So like it's more statistically significant than the evidence we use for diabetes, metformin for diabetes, for statins, for SSRIs, and yet those things are standard of care. And if you try talking about psychic abilities to almost anyone, they're going to judge you and they're going to diminish your discernment in their eyes. I know because I've been doing this for a year now, almost as a personal experiment. And there's a one-to-one correlation between how left-brained someone is and how angry they get about the topic and how disdainful they get about you. And that, for me, kind of encapsulates the woo. But there is stuff over on the other end of the spectrum that probably is, like, untouchably weird. And, like, there you go. And that's a bad example, but I struggle with it.
So a high woo rating would be something that you're just tempted to throw out for whatever reason.
Yeah. Or that just, like... Well, part of it is that it violates too many premises that we've based our lives on. And part of it is that it's impractical. And so I'm not going to touch any woo topic that doesn't have an immediate practicality, even as a metaphor. Because a lot of these things are really, really helpful as metaphors. That, like, I'll give you an example. So one of the things that came out of Mona's work was the concept of soul lessons, which is that reincarnation is real and you're placed on earth to learn lessons related to your spiritual awareness that all revolve around getting more loving and open. And you're like, do I think this is true? Well, the constant death and rebirth thing that you notice across wisdom practices fractally applies. It may fractally apply across life and death. Who knows? Reincarnation was not on my radar until the last year. And I encountered the work of Ian Stevenson at UVA that has a huge amount of empirical evidence in favor of reincarnation, which blew me away. But the point is not to sit here and try and convince people whether reincarnation is true. It's like, okay, if I framed my life in the concept of soul lessons, would it improve my lived experience? Does it resonate with me? Why does it resonate with me? Where does it resonate with me? It resonates with me. Why? Because me understanding my life in the context of a lesson that's going in one direction, and if the beatings get more severe as they have done, it's because I'm not learning a lesson and I'm going in the wrong direction. And that's really helpful for me. Doesn't need to be true, but it's helpful.
Makes sense. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to nudge us towards our closing questions, and I'm so glad you mentioned the leading edge because we haven't gotten into that. But can you just share what you're up to with the leading edge? And related to that, please make sure you include. We always like to ask how what kind of help you're looking for, and how people could get in touch with you if they can be helpful in that way.
I'm too active on Twitter at Tom Owen Morgan and theleading-edge.org. I had a very, 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 very bad nervous breakdown, dark night of the soul in Manhattan that lasted just over 2 years. I had no access to resources, community, or practitioners that I could trust, really at all. And then I went on podcasts for 3 years and talked about it. And the week after, between 5 and 10 people who looked and sounded exactly like me would call me or DM me on Twitter and say, I thought I was the only one. And I'd say, John, you are the 9th person this week. We'd chat. They'd feel a lot better about their lives. They'd thank me. And then they'd say, what do I do next? And I'd say, you got nothing, dude. And as my interest in markets dwindled, the call got louder. And I realized I really had to form something. And then when I quit at the start of this year, my Sown speech went viral, which I believe was a little kiss from the universe saying that like, there's an audience for this. The Leading Edge is a community capped at 150 people. We're close to cap right now, at least conceptually, because the quality of the group has been so high. And it's a space. You know, it's been the meta theme of this entire conversation is space. It's a safe space for people to explore what they want to explore for their own, to find their own individual niche. They're in a transition of some kind, mostly, as we all are, but they lack access to good resources. So I think of it as like a restaurant where, or maybe even like a canteen, where you know everyone in the canteen, you're going to have great conversations, whichever table you sit down at, but everything you order off the menu is going to be really good. But I don't expect you to order the same thing off the menu as me. And access to good practitioners, access to good information, and access mostly to each other, and finding the tribe of people who are asking, is this it? Or can take me places I haven't gone before. Like it's true of all of you guys, that I found you guys all online and you've become like good friends. Like that, I worry about like systematizing it, but I'm going to systematize it because there are people that don't have what I have, and I know I can matchmake for them. What I need, I don't know. Like, I think that the sell side and the buy side in investing needs this. I think that like people won't talk about dream work in sell side research, like ever, right? I get that, and that's great because that opens up this business opportunity for me that I think is going to last, you know, at least 10 more years. But there's this idea that people do need the ability to speak about these things, and so I'm interested in people that work at investment funds or hedge funds or investment banks that are willing to have this conversation because I think it can help their employees and may even be able to help their business and certainly may even be able to help their investment returns. So that's something I'm interested of. And whilst we are closed, pretty much soft closed as a community, come speak to me. I'll try and help, but also start one of your own, right? What we're noticing is a network of networks where like the networks cannot be scalable beyond 150 people for reasons I can go into in tedious detail, but just take my word for it. And probably smaller than that based on my current experience. But what can be scaled infinitely is the content being produced by that community and the infrastructure, the tech infrastructure being used by it. The tech infrastructure for these things is doggy poop, I've noticed. And then also the content is infinitely scalable and great. So collaborators on both of those fronts is something I'm looking for as well.
Fantastic. And we'll put links and so forth in show notes, of course. Our closing question for everyone is, what is the highest expression of quality that you've encountered? That could be an experience, it could be a person, it could be an item, but what is the highest expression of quality that you've encountered?
That's where all of this came from. I think it was October 15th, 2017. I'd been getting very sick. I was in a financial institution that was lovely, but had nothing to do. I was put on a 3-month elimination diet that gave me access to subtle signals. I wrote a 60-page PDF that was the articulation of those subtle signals. And then one morning I was sitting at my desk and I understood what the Tao was, which was weird because I wasn't really thinking about it. And the other thing that it came to me was that the hero's journey is an operating manual. And then suddenly I exited consensus reality, or maybe entered it, depending on your perspective. My inner monologue shut down. I was bathed in a transcendent love that certainly defies explanation, but the closest word I can use is God. I started seeing energy flicker across the trees outside, and I was able to detect the emotional state of anyone within 12 feet of me. And whenever I said anything that wasn't true, my heart physically hurt. And I also gained mild precognitive abilities that lasted about 2 days. And then I oscillated between two personalities, one of which was filled with fear and was completely without emotional affect, and the other one that was lovely and flowy and glowy and a little bit too spiritual. That lasted about 2 months until I went into the dark night of the soul. But I was also downloaded insights in those few hours, which some would definitely term a psychotic break and would probably be right, and some would term a satori, and they would probably also be right. I was downloaded insights in those few hours that I am still working through 7 years later. And one of the better pieces of advice I received was, don't write about any of this for at least 4 years. And I ignored that for like 2 weeks. But like, that was quality for me. And it's still the fact that I felt that the foundation of everything was love. When it goes back to that question of, does the universe love you? 70% conviction.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Incredible answer. And thank you more broadly for your time with us. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thanks for having me, guys. I love you all.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom.
Much love.
Absolutely.
A lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening. And for more resources, please visit our website, theartofquality.co. If you think of anyone that could be a good fit for this format, please reach out via the website.